Ask someone who always plans for themselves why they don't just let others take the lead sometimes. And you'll usually get a version of the same answer. It's not that they can't. It's that something in them genuinely doesn't want to. That answer tends to frustrate people who see it as stubbornness or an unwillingness to be helped. But the psychology behind it is considerably more specific than that. And once you understand it, the behavior makes complete sense. Let's start with the most foundational piece. People who always plan for themselves typically have a high internal locus of control, a term psychologists use to describe the degree to which a person believes that what happens in their life is the result of their own choices and actions rather than external forces, luck, or other people's decisions. For people with a strong internal locus, their life is something they author, not something that happens to them. And that distinction is not abstract. It shapes how they relate to every significant decision they face. When someone else makes a plan for them, even a thoughtful, well-intentioned plan, something registers as off. It's not the content of the plan that's the problem. It's the structure of the situation. They've been placed inside a story they didn't write, heading somewhere they didn't choose, on a timeline they didn't set. For someone with a high need for autonomy, that experience is genuinely uncomfortable in a way that's difficult to explain to someone who doesn't feel it. Self-determination theory, developed by Deci and Ryan, identifies autonomy as one of the 3 core psychological needs that drive human well-being. Not a preference, a need. People who consistently operate without a sense of authorship over their own direction don't just feel mildly frustrated. Research shows they experience measurably lower well-being, lower motivation, and a diminished sense of meaning over time. The people who always plan for themselves aren't being difficult. They're protecting something fundamental. And it's worth being precise about what they're protecting. This is not about controlling other people. It's not about needing things done a specific way or being rigid about process. It's about the specific experience of being the one who decides where their life goes. That experience of genuine self-direction is something they've learned they need in order to feel like themselves. There is also something worth noting about how these people respond when plans made by others go wrong. For most people, a failed plan made by someone else produces frustration directed outward, at the person who made the plan. For people who always plan for themselves, a failed plan they made produces something different, a clear update to their own understanding. They learn from it, they adjust, and the next plan they make is better for it. The ownership of the plan and the ownership of the outcome are the same, which means the feedback loop is clean and direct. That is part of what makes self-planning feel not just preferable, but genuinely more effective to them over time. The second piece goes deeper and explains why the preference isn't simply about wanting control. These people know themselves well, not in a vague, self-congratulatory way, but in a specific, practical sense. They have accumulated a detailed understanding of what actually works for them, what doesn't, what they find energizing versus draining, what they'll regret, and what they won't. That knowledge was built over years of paying close attention to their own experience, noticing which choices left them satisfied and which ones, however reasonable they seemed at the time, turned out to be wrong fits. Psychologists who study individual differences in preferences have found that people vary enormously in what they find meaningful, satisfying, and suitable, and that these differences are often highly specific, context-dependent, and not easily communicated to others. What works for one person, even someone in a similar situation with similar goals, often doesn't translate cleanly. When someone else makes a plan for a person with this level of self-knowledge, the problem isn't usually the other person's intentions or intelligence. The problem is information. The person making the plan doesn't have access to the full picture. The preferences that were never stated because they seemed too specific to explain. The past experiences that ruled out certain options before they were even considered. The quiet priorities that don't show up in any conversation but shape everything about what will actually feel right. These people have usually had the experience of following a plan made by someone else and finding that it simply didn't fit. Not because it was badly designed, but because it was designed for a generic version of them rather than the actual one. And that experience, repeated enough times, produces a very practical conclusion. If you want a plan that works for you, you have to make it yourself. The third piece is the one most people misread, and it's the one that most directly addresses the question of whether this is about trust. It isn't, or at least not primarily. There's a common assumption that someone who insists on planning for themselves must not trust the people around them. But that conflates two very different things: trusting someone's intentions and trusting their information. These people often trust the intentions of the people in their lives completely. What they understand, clearly and without cynicism, is that good intentions and accurate information are not the same thing. To make a genuinely good plan for another person, you need to know a great deal about them. Their actual values, not the ones they've articulated in conversation. Their history with similar decisions. The things they've tried before and found wanting. The constraints they're working within that they haven't thought to mention because they seem obvious. The trade-offs they've already made and are no longer willing to revisit. The priorities that shift depending on factors that are invisible from the outside. Psychologists who study the limits of perspective taking, the ability to accurately model another person's internal state, have found consistent evidence that even people in close, long-term relationships have significant blind spots about each other's inner experience. We tend to project our own preferences and assumptions onto others more than we realize. And the gap between our model of someone and their actual experience is almost always larger than we think. People who always plan for themselves have arrived at a version of this understanding through lived experience. They've watched someone who knows them well make a plan that sounded reasonable and turned out to be wrong in ways the other person couldn't have anticipated. Not because they don't care, because they didn't have the full picture. And the full picture, for these people, is never fully available to anyone on the outside. This isn't a statement about distrust. It's a statement about epistemics, about what any person can actually know about another person, no matter how close they are or how much they care. And recognizing that limit clearly, without resentment or drama, is actually a sign of a fairly sophisticated understanding of how knowledge and relationships work. These people aren't pushing others away. They're being accurate about what others can and cannot provide, about what any person can actually know about another person, no matter how close they are or how much they care. So let's be clear about who these people are. They are not controlling. They are not unwilling to collaborate or accept help. They are not people who think they're always right or that other people's perspectives have no value. They are people who have a deep need to be the author of their own direction, who know themselves well enough to understand what a good plan for them actually requires, and who are clear-eyed about the limits of what anyone else, however well-intentioned, can know about them from the outside. In a culture that sometimes treats reliance on others as a virtue and self-sufficiency as a form of isolation, these people are making a quiet but deliberate choice. Not to shut others out, to make sure that the life they're living is actually theirs. The people who always plan for themselves aren't controlling. They're just clear about who they are, what they need, and whose job it is to figure that out. If that resonated, leave a comment. I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'll see you in the next video.